The saddle never looks like much from a distance, just a long white hesitation between higher backs of ice, but it has the kind of quiet that asks for manners. I came up on skins before the wind rose, dragging the sled with the kit that makes a day feel solvable. Ablation stakes bundled like reeds, the GPS base in its foam cradle, the snow saw wrapped in canvas so it would not chew the nylon, the solar logger asleep under its hood, the field notebook zipped inside my chest pocket where my breath could keep it warm enough to turn. I set the tripod on a patch the wind had burnished to hard skin and built the base, not rushing, letting each leg find a seat, letting the little hairline bubbles settle in my internal checks, even if my instruments do not admit to bubbles. I spoke the sequence under my breath, as I always did, because sometimes the voice keeps the hands honest. Shelter upwind, cable path down, antenna clear of straps, power on last. The sky made the kind of blue that fails to feel like a sky, more like a lid put on a pot and forgotten. And the only smell was the clean that is not a smell until you lose it. My partner was a ridge of sastrugi and the low whistle that moved along it as the breeze freshened. I marked the saddle crown with a little flag for crossing reference, and then pressed the first ablation stake, just shy of mid-thigh depth, angling it a hair to give it bite. The hammer found a rhythm I recognized from other jobs, a wooden patience knocking into an old story. I sighted against the ridge and glanced toward the sun, and took the note the way I always do. Stake one in, top flush with glove seam, shadow points across the fall line. No digits on the page, only words that let me remember later. I planted a second stake downwind where the scoured crust returned a softer pack, and set a third closer to the ridge break, where the world falls away toward the blue interior. Each one went in with the same small fight ice always gives, not personal, just policy. I cut a shallow pit with the snow saw to read the layers, and my saw teeth sang that familiar dry glass song as they moved across the old wind slab into softer grains and then a thin, brittle crust. The pit was only a hand deep, but it told the story of the last weather. A hard breath, a pause, a warmer brush, another breath. By late morning, the light had the white heat that makes you narrow your eyes until the ice seems to hum. I walked the triangle between stakes and back to the GPS base, and gave the top of the case a small, affectionate tap that I would never confess in a report. The solar logger woke clean. The base chirped its first hello, and then its steady litany, as if it were counting without numbers. I tuned for the saddle's habit of drift, knowing that on these long flats a field of errors can masquerade as a map. It all settled quickly, too quickly, as if the saddle wanted me to trust it, and I wrote the comfort of that down, even though I do not trust comfort in places like this. The wind came up another notch and brushed a faint hush over the ridge whistle, turning it from one voice into another. The air's cold lay in the curve of my cheekbones, and I accepted it. Just before noon, I saw the first wrong thing. It was nothing at first, the kind of nothing that belongs in a line of a notebook, except my hands paused on their way to the thermistor patch. The shadow of the near stake tightened against itself and then leaned in a direction that did not match the small turn the sun had made. It was a breath of lean, a slight, and I have learned to trust slights. I walked to it slow, unshowy, a person taking stock of how the harness sits, and whether the strap across the sternum has taken up too much when layered over the down. The stake stood straight as I had left it. The mind makes stories, so I used the saw handle as a plumb and let my eye fall on the ridgeline beyond. The ridge had not moved, though the sastrugi told of nights when they all would. I crouched and palmed the ice near the stake, and the cold there felt ordinary, but a tiny rasp came up through the glove, as if something below had taken a small step, and then set its foot again where it had been, the way a person does when testing a board in an old porch. I wrote that as a question in the book. Shadow lean at midday that did not match. Under it, I copied a fragment I had told myself I would never put in ink. Wind maps what it loves. That was a phrase my first lead had used when I was still learning the difference between data and words you keep to yourself. The wind tries to draw. Some days the drawings stick. I stood and listened to the saddle. The whistle along the ridge had split into two short lines, a main tone and a companion, as if the ridge had learned harmony. The logger kept its even pulse, a metronome that would soothe a nervous person. And I told myself not to be nervous. I spent another stretch running the usual checks a person runs when they will not argue with their own eyes. I stepped stake to stake with the shovel in hand, as if I were merely deciding whether to waste time on a second pit. I pressed my ear to the first stake, and the ice there took the sound of wind and turned it into a shallow ground note that I felt in the bowl of my ear rather than heard. At the downwind stake, the sound was different. It had a tiny hitch, a kind of click placed inside the lower hum, too soft to be a fracture talk, too regular to be turbulence. At the ridge stake, there was a delay, the hitch arriving like an afterthought. I walked back to the base and looked at the first fixes. The points lay as I had left them, neat and loyal. The logger time tags ran ahead by a beat, and then, strange to admit, fell back by a breath into the pocket I expected. I scrawled a line I would later wish I had not. Base clock listened to something else briefly. A snow petrel passed close enough to flick its profile against the white, and then it was gone toward the lower basin where open sky makes liars of our measurements. I cut the second pit after all, at the stake whose shadow had leaned wrong, because work is how a person replies when a place begins to play. The saw's teeth dragged through crust again, and the smell came up that does not belong to ice, a dry sweetness like a book pulled from a sunlit shelf. I felt foolish immediately for thinking it, then more foolish for writing a note about it. I pressed my bare fingers to the cut face for a count and waited for the ache. The face felt colder than its neighbor by a hair, enough to make the skin sing sooner. The top grains there had settled into an odd carpet, not quite aligned with the wind's usual way. Each facet turned as if listening to a language I do not speak. I took the hand auger to the leeward side of the saddle crown and drove it a shallow span before the flutes choked. The shavings that came up were polite, without the dull sparkle of wet, but the sound in the shaft carried a faint skitter, as if the bit had run across a seam of coarser shapes set on edge. When I pulled the auger, the hole exhaled a breath that did not taste like anything familiar. I knelt with my face near the rim and waited. There was no smell at all, which is its own kind of scent when you have spent seasons making friends with very small differences. I marked the hole with a flag and gave myself a rule. Leave flags in place until the day's end, even the silly ones, especially the silly ones. The sun walked its slow arc, and the saddle offered a little warmth that lived only on the outer cloth of my gloves, the kind that tricks you into thinking you are safer than you are. I stood in the exact spot where I had first noticed the lean and watched the stake's shadow again. It lay where it should, moved where it should, then paused for a heartbeat, then moved again. If a person had blinked at the wrong moment, they would have missed it. I watched until the pauses made a pattern, a kind of stutter that did not agree with the wind's rhyme. I put a circle around that note and wrote a word I did not like writing: creeping. I ran a quick radio fragment into the notebook as if transcribing a transmission, a habit from other seasons when we left a trail for later. Tech on saddle, routine checks within range, observing slight noon creep at near stake, possible shadow artifact, continuing grid. The grid was a simple diamond around the crown that would tell me whether the saddle wore a tilt invisible at human scale. I dragged the sled to each corner, planted the pole, waited for the base to do its steady, small calculus, and moved again. The base stayed calm, falsely calm, like a person agreeing to every question with a smile that does not touch the eyes. When I closed the diamond, I felt that something had closed around me as well. Not a threat, more like a polite audience waiting to see if I would clap. I sat on the sled and took water, as if that choice could anchor the rest. The wind dropped a little. The ridge whistle separated into single notes again. The stakes stood where I had placed them. The logger made the same even tick against the shield. The sky had the same lid. The saddle held the same quiet that asks for manners. I told myself that the rest of the day would be the data kind of day, and that the wrong lean would be a trick of my eyes, or the kind of minute wavering that disappears when you run a mean over a week. Then the downwind stake gave a subtle, guilty sound through the ice, a sound like a line paying out under a glove, and the shadow pinned to the surface for a breath before letting go. I did not write that one down at once. Some notes need to sit in the throat before they make it to paper. I stood and tightened my hood and made the decision I knew the station would not love if I typed it into a report. I would stay on the saddle through noon proper and watch the grid again, meter by meter in my head without numbers. And if the creep made itself into a rule, I would pull the stakes and reset them with stamps at the feet. Little boots of hard snow, the way you do when a stake wants to learn to walk. I would do that even if it meant walking back later than the plan. Orders exist to keep you alive. Field reality exists to remind you what alive costs. I put the pencil against the paper at last and wrote the line that would make me answer a mild email later. Noon hold at saddle to observe pattern. By the time the sun had lifted enough to make the ice glare again, I had the feeling my first lead had warned me about a long time ago. The sense that the place you are measuring has decided to measure you back. I kept my voice even inside the hood and called the routine to myself again, not loud, just enough that if any part of the day had a will, it would know I had one too. I checked the base. I thumbed the logger. I pressed the glove to the stake and felt the tiny rasp again. The polite step. The way a thing might move if it knew someone was counting in words instead of numbers. I closed the notebook and breathed slow until it vanished into the pocket heat. And there was only ice and wind, and a thin suspicion that the saddle's calm was not calm at all, just very old patience watching me work. I kept the saddle through the bright middle as promised, a small act of disobedience dressed up as method. The wind eased and then returned in shallow pulses, walking the sastrugi like a hand along corrugated metal. I set the sled as a lee, reset the notebook on the flat of my thigh, and wrote a calm opening line so I would not become the kind of person who starts a page with an omen. The base purred its ordinary speech under the solar hood. I touched the antenna bracket and told myself to treat it like any other day, which is to say, believe nothing until the same thing happens twice. The snow saw lay across the sled rails where I could take it up without looking. The ablation stakes made their clean verticals. Their shadows pointed as they should, until they did not. The first pause in the downwind shadow came again, softer, as if the sun had hiccuped behind a high veil, but the sky was unbroken. I watched the ridge stake and the delay arrive there, a breath later, not long enough to be comfort, long enough to be a sequence. I wrote it that way, a small chain, and marked each link with a single word so I would not be tempted into digits. Then I did what the job asks when a thing repeats. I tried to break it on purpose. I pressed a boot circle at the foot of the nearest stake, a hard collar, and smoothed it with the shovel face so I would see if the stake tried to take a step. I shaded the stake head with my glove to check whether glare made fools of outlines. The shadow kept its small stammer, the collar stayed clean, and I began to feel the old weight that comes with being the only witness in a place large enough to make doubt feel like weather. I ran a check on the GPS base that was half liturgy, half superstition. Antenna clear, cable seated, ground plane free of drift flakes, power steady under the hood, logger tick in step with the wrist. The tick slipped by a hair and then recovered. I told myself it was the cold teasing the board, and wrote that in the book, as if writing could make it so. I called the station on the handheld to put a normal sound in the day. The return came back thin, as it does over ice, and the delay was exactly as long as I expected. The voice asked for a shareable note, and I gave them the bland truth. Routine grid, no hazards, midday watch continuing. I did not mention the shadow. You do not lead with poetry when the line recorder is awake. By now the sun sat high enough to polish the crust into a sheet that looked wet, though it was not. I stepped off my own tracks and cut a narrow slot at the stake, whose sound in the ice reminded me of lines slipping under a glove. The saw teeth gave their dry song in the top layer, then a softer hum, then a brittle chatter against a skin I had not felt in the first pit. In the face, the grains had gathered themselves into tilting plates. A tiny audience inclined the same hour. Unlike the wind's usual schooling, when I pressed my knuckles to the wall, the cold bit sooner than it should in light like this, a quickening that felt localized, as if the pit had its own weather. I leaned closer and waited for smell. The faint sweetness came again, not strong enough to accuse the place of being anything but ice, strong enough to make my mouth remember a reading room at the end of a long day. I backed out and worked the grid that I had drawn in my head before dawn. Corner toward the basin, corner toward the ridge, corner toward the deeper interior, corner back toward the approach line. I carried the pole as if it were just a pole, and not the little flag I plant at the limits of my courage. At each stop I gave the base time to settle, listening to the logger pulse because that was the beat that comforted me when light tried to lie. The points landed with the kind of confidence a map loves. The confidence felt unearned. When I closed the loop, it was tighter than I had walked it. My tracks disagreed with the closure, as if the saddle had practiced a slight pantry shift while I wasn't looking, the way a house settles. I circled the note in the book and labeled it drift of feeling, not fact. The wind returned along the ridge with a tone I had not heard on this saddle, a second voice tucked inside the first, like a whistle played with the tongue half down. I turned my head and let the hood break the sound apart. Beneath the wind, a thin murmuring lived in the surface. Not a crack talk, not a melt whisper, more like the sizzle of a page rubbed with a thumb, stop and start, just enough to be noticed when you stare too long at one thing. I set a gloved hand to the downwind stake again, and the tiny rasp answered my palm. An animal patience testing leash slack. The upwind stake remained formal and cold. The ridge stake sulked, giving its sound in the kind of delayed way a shy person offers agreement after the decision has already been made. I tried the ordinary ways of scolding a system back into line. I retensioned the guy on the base mast. I brushed frost bloom from the solar window and watched the charge rise a whisper. I crowded a small berm around the leeward leg of the tripod so gusts would not tease a wobble into the stream. I packed the stake collars firmer, ankles of ice around the shanks, and I set the snowsaw flat on the crust near the nearest shadow to read the shine for artifacts. The shadow still stammered. I stared long enough to feel foolish and then turned away on purpose to give the day a chance to become normal while I looked at anything else. I walked to the approach line as if I had just arrived and took the saddle in fresh. From that distance, the stakes were the only punctuation on an otherwise indifferent page. I paused at the small crown flag that I had planted first light and found it had shifted in its own hole the tiniest amount, the cloth tag facing another way than I remembered. A breeze could do that, or a glove brushing it, or the kind of small movement that comes when ice sighs. I put the flag back by twisting the stem until the cloth looked as it had. When I turned, the tracks I had made to the basin corner seemed farther apart than when my legs had laid them. I closed my eyes as if that would reset scale. It did not. I returned to the base and put my boot soles flat so the edges would not cut a record into the surface that I would later mistake for a line. I wrote a small report to myself in the notebook, with the tone my first lead had used when we felt cold respect for a place. Treat noon as live. Observe quietly. Do not chase. If pattern persists, trap it with routine rather than force. It read like kindness because that is the trick of procedure. It makes us polite when we are unsure. The light scooped down a little from its highest eye, and the bricks of glare softened into a working sheen. The logger tick dropped out for a single beat and came back in exactly where it should have been if it had never left. I laughed once inside my hood because the mind loves to be mocked by a machine that does not care. I put the glove to the mast and placed the other glove to the stake and tried to feel a link. What came back was not a link but a posture, as if the saddle had shifted its weight onto one hip to match mine, companionable and unnerving. I stepped away and heard the faint paper murmur again in the ice. The smell did not come with it this time. The surface above the nearest pit had crusted slightly since I cut it, a thin veil already rehearsing how to forget me. I checked the sky because sometimes a halo tells you the light is playing tricks. The blue stayed a stubborn, hard lid. A tiny sparkle passed in the air and died, a fleck of diamond dust in a place that should not throw such bright. The ridge whistle eased back to a single note. A petrel nowhere near enough to account for any of it cut a quick arc and was gone toward the interior. The world decided to be ordinary again and left me holding a set of small wrongs that only existed because I had stared long enough to catch them. I wrote their names in the book with the care you give to spelling a place. Shadow stammer, stake rasp, base beat missing, and returned. Grid closure tighter than legs, flag turned without a hand. The station called once more with the same careful voice people use when they imagine a field tech forgetting to eat. I told them I would pack at mid-afternoon and start back along the approach. I did not say that I would leave the flags in place at the corners, a breadcrumbing that would read as untidy in a later audit. I added it only to my own notes, a quiet rule about not erasing a conversation while it is still speaking. I closed the book and let the pocket warmth take it, then opened it again because the small weight against my chest had become a comfort, a little animal I wanted to keep awake in case the saddle wanted to tell me anything else. When the sun pressed on toward the far edge of its arc, the downwind stake gave another of those polite, guilty sounds under my palm. The shadow obeyed and then lost tension, as if it had been held and released by hands I could not see. I set my boot against the collar, and the rasp did not repeat. I stepped back and let the sensation of being measured fade to the more useful feeling of being merely cold and a little tired. I told myself I would pull the stakes and reset them with boots of packed snow if the next day made the case. I told myself that leaving the grid flags was not superstition, but experiment. I told myself a lot of things and believed most of them just enough to move. I broke the base down with the care of a person closing a delicate book. The cable ran sweetly into its coil. The solar hood folded with its little crackle. The mast sections received each other without complaint. I left the stakes standing, each with its small collar, each with its private mind. The sled rope ran light in my glove. The ridge whistled plain again. No harmony, just the honest single tone. I took a last look over the crown and felt the saddle look back with that old patience I had named in the morning. The shadows lay long enough to look settled, and then, at the edge of sight, quivered once the way a horse's skin shivers against a fly. I decided not to write that. I carried it instead. Night at the station is an arrangement of small lamps and familiar drawers, the kind of order meant to reassure a mind that just spent its day letting distance change size. I hung the damp canvas sack with the snow saw on the line by the stove, rolled the sled rope back into its tidy coil, and lined my boots on their sides so the liners would dry without losing their shape. The field notebook sat on the bench like a quiet animal. I left it closed because I wanted the day to stay whole for a little while longer. The solar logger case went on the table under the brighter light where we do the evening purge. I told myself this would be the cleanest part. Plug, pull, label, store. No story there, just running water in a pipe. The base opened the way it always does, with the little chime that is neither cheerful nor unkind. I rigged the cable, and the machine accepted it at once. The screen gave its list of polite questions, and I answered them in the order the job teaches. Transfer began without complaint. I settled my elbows and let the hiss of the stove be the metronome. Outside the plywood walls, the wind moved around in spared footsteps, not quite deciding on a steady walk. I poured a glass of water, and it smelled like nothing at all. A luxury. The first block finished and the second started, and with it came the thing I had not wanted. The file contained the day I had lived until it did not. The fixed scatter drew the neat shape that matched my body's sense of the saddle. Then a short run of points eddied toward a side where I had not stood. I leaned into the display and told my breath to slow down. A lens can jump if a mast twitches, I said aloud, as if the room would nod. I scrolled back and checked the weather tag. The gusts had been small and steady. The mast had worn its little berm. I played the span again and watched the drift return to the exact shape it had drawn before. A thing that repeats tries to be believed. The logger has a mouth even if it does not speak. Its channel text is a tiny grammar of assurances. In the middle of those assurances, the timestamp row sat out of step by a hair. Not wrong, not proud enough to claim error, just pulled forward and let go, like a person stepping off a curb and changing their mind. Where it pulled, the pit notes in my book mentioned the dry paper smell and the faint steak rasp that had felt like line creeping under a glove. I copied a fragment from the file to the notebook, the way I was taught to do for later review. Base steady, channel steady, time drifted briefly forward and returned, coincide with smell and shadow stammer, noted by field. I printed a small strip, the kind we pin by our desks to remind us of the day, and the paper came out with a tiny burr down one edge, a lace that tickled my palm. I ran my thumb along it until the burr broke into crumbs and fell like dry snow. The strip showed the loop closure number that lives inside our jargon, and the picture agreed with my legs and yet did not. The closure was cleaner than my walking, the kind of clean that suggests a hand has straightened a crooked picture when you turn to put your gloves away. I pinned it to the cork, and the thumbtack squeaked like a small complaint. I laughed too quickly, and it sounded like a cup placed down too firmly. The last block of data came with a small hiccup in the transfer, an error code that resolved itself before it had time to name its source. On the audit sheet, I wrote the gentle lie we always write when a thing misbehaves but returns. Transient. To prove I was not superstitious, I said the word out loud once. Then I did what we all do when a system that claims to be calm shows a face that is not. I went looking for familiar faults to hold in my hands, so I would not have to hold the other thing. I checked USB contacts for frost, blew down the cable path, reseated the cradle on its foam, powered the laptop brick on and off, and counted my breaths. The hiss from the stove climbed and fell, suggesting the damper needed a tweak. I left it as it was in case the sound might turn truthful if I did not touch it. When I played the noon window again, the pulses the logger writes as small teeth on a line moved into a rhythm that felt like handwriting. They grew slightly taller for a handful of beats, then settled back into their bookish row. I do not say that line height means meaning. I say that I could not unsee the cadence. I scrolled to the early morning strand where I had first marked the saddle crown and found the same lift hiding there like a faint parenthesis in the humdrum. The day had written in the same hand at dawn and noon. I sat back hard enough to make the chair talk. A person who wants to keep a job does not write feelings as findings without a lot of penance first. I opened the field notebook and, to make room for honesty, I transcribed a short pretend radio exchange into the margin. Technician 1 to Technician Self. Confirm noon cadence in logger pulse similar to opening cadence. Pattern weak but present. Advise further watch. Likely environmental crosstalk. Proceed with routine. The joke of it let me breathe. The margin took the ink and warmed under my palm like skin. I put the book down, and it made that soft thump paper makes when it lands with a little air under it. On the shelf above the table, the win trophies that predecessors left rattled with a tiny, polite clink. A feathered sastrugi chip, a blown pin flag stem, a white pebble from a moraine that the rules say should not be here. They gathered light when the door moved on its latch. The room settled around those small artifacts like a glove pulled on right side out. I rested my head for a span on my arms, thinking I would wait for the last progress bar to reach its house. In that drift of almost sleep, the logger's blue blink became a pulse that my body wanted to set its breathing to. When I sat up again, the bar had finished, and the file list looked as tidy as any boring day. I placed the solar logger on its side to listen for the tick through the case. It is a sound most people stop hearing after the first season, a tapping moth inside a jar. That night, it sounded like a drip in a far room, where a pipe has a joint loose by a hair. I put my ear to the plastic and the tick stepped forward and back again, in and out of the rhythm I believed in. A dancer taking small liberties when the teacher turns. Not proof, not even evidence in a way that counts. Enough to make a person want the day to choose a side. I copied the files to the archive and wrote a polite email draft I did not send. It said, Saddle grid ordinary, minor logger cadence, anomaly, at dawn and noon, base time drifted, then recovered, recommend continued observation, no hazard, incremental curiosity only. Beneath the draft I wrote a second version that admitted to the map shrinking under my boots and the shadow that paused to be counted. I deleted that one because I am not paid to confess my private metaphors. The stove asked for more fuel. I fed it and watched the flame reflect in the window, where the night and the snow pretend to be two different things. Outside, the wind had gone quiet enough to hear the sky make its dry hiss across the roofline. The station has a sound the ice grants it when calm tolerates walls. It was present. It was also paired with something just below hearing, a suggestion of velvet rubbing velvet, breath on paper, the same texture I had heard in the pit face when the smell lifted that didn't belong to weather. I told myself it was the chimney fussing with itself, and let that be an answer for a while. Before sleep, I laid the stakes list open on the bench and added encouragements in plain words, the way I was taught back when equipment was scarce, and we treated each instrument like a friend doing us a favor. Ridge stake hold true. You are the north on this table. Thank you. Downwind stake. Show me what you want to do, and I will not trap you too early. Upwind stake. Keep your formality, so I know what cold looks like. A person who does this work learns to talk to objects when the day grows large. The rule is to do it quietly and without worship. I killed the bigger light and let the small lamp by the logger glow. In that half dark, the blue blink grew companionable again. After a span, I realized it was not steady. It lagged once in every handful, a pocket the mind could fall into and imagine words. I denied it words. I lay down on the bunk without undressing. Boots lined on their side like two faces turned to listen. The room breathed. The ice outside did not. Or it did, and the sound folded back on itself before traveling. I held the notebook against my chest until my body heat made it feel alive. When I slept, I dreamt that the base had printed a ribbon of paper that dropped off the table and coiled on the floor, and along its length, the pulse marks had turned into little hashings that refused to be numbers and yet insisted on being read. In the morning, if the world chose kindness, the logger would blink like a metronome that had never heard of me, and the saddle would meet its shadows without stammer, and the stakes would be just stakes again. If the world chose something else, I would take my kit back to the crown with my manners on, and ask my instruments to tell the same story twice. I left the lamp on a little longer than I needed to, and watched the blink repeat its small liberty, then folded my arm over my eyes so the room could decide what kind of day it wanted, while I pretended not to watch. Somewhere in the logs, inside the tidy stamps and lockstep lines, the saddle had tucked the confession in the spaces between beats. I could feel it without reading it yet. I went back to the saddle before the light was sure of itself, cutting the approach with lazy skins so my legs would remember the way without being taught again. The station's advice of rest and conserve had arrived in the night, with that polite language that knows it will be ignored when the field makes its own weather. I left a reply unsent on the desk and took the kit instead. Ablation stakes left in place yesterday, GPS base and its shy chime, snow saw in a dry sock, solar logger wrapped inside my jacket until the warmth I owed it seeped in, the field notebook pressed flat against my chest like a promise. I told myself out loud that I would let the grid speak and that I would not argue with it. The words sounded like someone else being responsible on my behalf. The saddle wore a frost skin that caught the first light in a way that suggested heat where there was none. My flags from yesterday stood where I had planted them, cloths hanging without conviction. The stakes kept their formal verticals, no boot collars disturbed, no friendly animal tracks to blame for feelings. The ridge carried a thin reed of wind, more breath than voice. I set the base where I had set it before, because routine is the only fairness I know how to grant, even to a place that has the patience to measure me big. I built the mast and the little berm at its leeward leg and plugged the solar into its hood, listening for the logger's moth tap. It arrived obedient and then took a shy step out of rhythm the way it had in the station. I marked that in the notebook with a line that did not claim certainty. I walked the grid corners slowly and spoke their names under my breath in case the saddle had come to like being greeted. Crown toward basin, basin toward interior, interior toward ridge, ridge toward approach. The base settled quickly each time, too quickly if you care about comfort as a sign. I bent to the near stake and pressed my palm against the shaft. The tiny rasp answered me. It felt practiced now, less like a mistake, more like an announcement a shy person rehearses under covers before trying it on a room. The shadow of the shaft lay where it should, then stumbled by a heartbeat, then shrugged back into line. I wrote it as a stammer. It did not mind being named. At the basin corner, the light made a watery trick of the crust, and my saw's teeth sang across it when I cut a shallow slot to give myself an excuse for touching the day. Below the crust, the grain showed that same gentle lean. Each tiny facet turned as if listening with one ear. The face gave up the dry sweetness again, fainter, a memory of paper rather than a room full of it. I cupped a handful and brought it to my nose like a child learning snow, and smelled mostly nothing, and a little of that other thing. I pressed the scarf back up under my nose and stood a while counting, not with numbers, but with breaths until the smell thinned into the honest cold. I reset the pole at the interior corner and watched the base write its neat hiss of computations into the ether. While I waited, I arranged my thinking like tools on a table. The saddle had given me a cadence at dawn and at noon. The logger had leaned into it and leaned away. The stakes had learned to mark a step that did not belong to sun or wind. If I kept to the grid, the place might keep telling. If I broke it, the place might stop. I made a rule that I knew I would betray if asked. Hold the line until the line bends you. The points that came back from the base drew a shape that matched yesterday within the softness any day allows. Except the loop closure smoothed itself in a way my bones did not trust. I had walked the corners wider than the tight little drawing claimed. The picture was the better version of me. I wanted to accept that praise and go home. The only honest thing I could do was refuse it. I placed the pole on the exact crust, scars my basket had left a breath before, and held still long enough for wind to write a gloss around my boots. The base produced the same loyal point, like a student copying a good answer from the day prior. I laughed once without enjoying it, and marked the laugh in the notebook, as if it might be data. I went to the ridge stake and laid my cheek against the cold metal for a count that I did not give a number to. The ice there spoke in the low way large bodies do when they have no interest in you. Then the delayed hitch arrived, late as always, apologetic but insistent. I crossed to the downwind stake, pressed glove to shaft, and felt the leash sound again. A pet gentle slide. I wanted to cuff it for moving when dogs are to heel. Instead, I cut a slot beside it, no deeper than the length of my palm, and waited with my face near the trench. The smell came clear and quick, absurd and undeniable. Dry paper warmed and then pressed shut. I said the words out loud like a person forcing a confession to go small. I said old book. The wind took it and made of it nothing. I chalked the snow with an edge of my glove to make tiny witness marks around each stake in case they wished to learn a step while I looked elsewhere. I am a believer in marks that forgive their maker. The ice accepts chalk like a signature. It will wash away with the first honest weather. Then I did the impolite thing a careful technician does only when patience chooses to be theatrics. I pulled the near stake with a set of small twists and laid it across the sled. leaving its hole clean and its collar untouched. I stood back and watched the empty slot until it became an eye. The ridge wind played the rim and made a bottle tone a child might learn by breathing. I replaced the stake without moving my boots and tamped the collar with 2 kind taps. The shadow stammered again. The chalk lines around the boot collar remained an honest circle. Some wrongs refused to wear fingerprints. The station chimed the handheld in my pocket with a check-in that tried to sound casual and landed like a teacher's light hand on a shoulder. I used the tone I reserve for telling kind people that everything is fine, while I lay the table for admitting that it may not be. I said the grid is closing, and the corners are behaved, and there is curiosity. At noon I intend to watch, and I asked for silence until after the short high sun. The voice granted it, and added an encouragement about warm drinks on return that made my chest feel briefly human. When the sun rose to its hard angle and laid a blade of brightness across the saddle crown, the downwind stake's shadow paused and then took a little step to the side. I felt it before I saw it, in the same place in the chest that catches when a door opens farther than the hinge allowed yesterday. The base blinked its little blue eye, and the logger's moth tick took its liberty and then returned to the school. I told my hands to work because hands are trustworthy, even when a map feels like butter trying to forget the shape of bread. I moved to the basin corner and planted the pole, then to the interior, then to the ridge, then back to crown. The points arrived where they should, and yet the picture composed itself slant. A perfect shape tipped like a book leaned on a shelf to keep it from sliding. My legs had walked a square. The saddle preferred a parallelogram, even though the corners had not moved at all. I set the notebook open on the sled to let the sun warm its pages, so the pencil would not scratch like a nail against stone. The wind quieted until the ridge lost its reed, and only the roof of the world whispered in the soft way it has when cold grows thoughtful. I wrote a line that would be quarrelsome in a meeting and harmless on the ice because no one was listening but me. Grid closes, grid also leans, surface still, instruments cheerful, person less so. I left a space beneath it for whatever the day wanted to add. At the crown, I pressed my forehead against the mast and let the heat in me travel into the metal until the sting leveled my thinking. A small flicker passed through the base, a tiny tremor that could have been frost unhooking, or the board reminding me it is not alive but enjoys pretending. The flags I had promised not to pull moved without wind, their cloth turning to present their blank sides like faces choosing not to answer. I placed the snow saw on the surface for shade and crouched beside the shallow slot I had cut. The smell had gone reluctant, as if embarrassed at having been named. The grains in the face held their odd tilt, an audience waiting for a cue line. I gave it one. I tapped the stake with 2 knuckles, light and ordinary, the way you might invite a table to attention before lifting a glass. The shadow held, then gave a soft, sympathetic twitch, no more than a flinch. I told myself I had imagined it and told myself I had not. I checked the chalk ring at the stake's foot and found one mark nicked, not smudged, not trampled, just broken as if something had pressed there from the wrong side. I wrote wrong side and then crossed it out and wrote under surface pressure because reports prefer dignified lies. I stepped away from the crown and stood at the approach flag where a person would decide to leave if they were better at boundaries. The sled strap lay in my glove with a tempting lightness. The ridge sang nothing at all. The sky made its lid. The logger ticked moth tick. The base blinked blue. The stakes kept their careful arms at their sides. Every part of the day was polite. I felt measured again, but not as a challenge now, more like a tailor's tape gently done. I know enough to prefer the ruder kinds of warning. I lifted the sled rope and turned my back to the crown long enough to choose the first long glide home. When I faced the saddle again, the flags looked different in a way I could not prove with eyes, only with the stomach's barometer. The grid had not moved, and yet it had slid a whisper sideways, as if budgeted by a rule I did not know how to voice. I stood there until the cold reached the bone that tells a person truth, and pressed the notebook to my chest, as if to teach it my pulse, so it would later understand the gaps in the logger. Then I made my promise the way field techs do, when they cannot sign contracts with places. I would leave the flags in place, and I would come back, and I would ask the same questions in the same order until the saddle either grew bored or forgot to be careful with me. Behind me, the long white way home offered its kind of peace. In front of me, the crown in its leaning picture asked for manners I had not yet learned. I said the name of the place once, softly, the way you say a person's name when you are not sure what mood they are in. The wind took it and made it its own. I turned the sled and started away, and at the edge of sight, One stake's shadow gave a small apology, a nod a friend might give when letting you leave, while both of you know the real conversation would happen tomorrow. The station wanted a quiet day of bookkeeping and a quick check of the approach flags, but I went back to the saddle with the same small stubbornness that kept my first lead employed and occasionally scolded. I told the radio a measured plan built from reasonable words: inspect flags, verify grid integrity, retrieve nothing, minimal time on surface. What I meant was, leave everything as it is and listen harder. The sled ran light behind me. The logger rode inside my jacket, warm as a live thing. The snow saw wore its dry sock like a gentled animal. The field notebook pressed its steady comfort into my ribs. The sky had resolved into that lid hardness that refuses to admit distance. No storm, just a feeling that boundaries would not take pity on a person who got casual. I found the first flag by sound rather than sight. A tiny crackle as its cloth rubbed against a frozen burr on the stem. Each corner greeted me with that same hushed little language, as if the grid had been whispering to itself in my absence and stopped when I came near. I did not move them. I read their stances like the postures of friends after an argument and wrote small notes without romance. Crown flag faces away from approach. Basin flag leans by a hair toward interior. Ridge flag listless, rope twist present. Approach flag uneager, cloth notched. The words did not feel like much, which meant they were likely worth keeping. The stakes stood as I had left them, each wearing its neat ankle of snow, as if embarrassed by attention. I resisted the urge to tamp those collars smoother and left their tiny nicks and witness chalk undisturbed. The downwind stake gave its soft leash sound under my palm, and the shadow stammered once, then lay still, as if to say that our conversation did not require theatrics today. The ridge stake stayed formal but generous, offering its delayed little hitch like a host who cannot help confessing a private worry. I put my ear to the ice by the near stake, and let the cold climb the cartilage until it asked me to move. Somewhere beneath, the faint paper-on-paper murmur returned, not constant, not absent, like someone turning a page and then holding it half open in indecision. I set the base where it liked to stand, and built its small berm as much for ritual as for physics. The solar lid opened with its pet crackle. The logger began its moth tap obediently and then took a breath of liberty, stepping out and back the way a metronome will sometimes do when tired eyes grow too fond of it. I marked the tick's small trespass in plain language and made myself a promise I doubted I could keep. No pulling, no moving, no teaching. Let the saddle have its say without interruption. The notebook liked that sentence, warming under my glove as if flattered by my restraint. Mid-morning made a clean light that shows every impatience a person brings to ice. I cut a shallow slot beside the downwind stake and leaned close. The smell was almost gone, a ghost of dry paper that might have been memory rather than air. The grains held their gentle lean, an audience still waiting for a cue I did not dare give. I closed the slot with the back of the saw and stepped away as if from a sleeping child. The base produced the neat picture it loves, and the loop closure sat tidier than my legs had walked it, a charity I no longer trusted. I did not copy the shape. I wrote how it felt. Picture better than the path honest. The handheld chimed with a check that pretended to be casual. I chose my tone with care. I said I would remain until the highest light and leave the flag standing through evening, that I would retrieve nothing unless hazard required it. The voice came back with the soft concern that can make a person forgive bureaucracy. Fuel tidy, sky steady, step away if wind climbs, we like you, returned with fingers. I thanked them with a steadier voice than I felt, and clicked the set quiet. I took the sled rope and rehearsed leaving so that staying would be a choice rather than a drift. The rope lay warm in the palm where jacket heat had bled into glove, a borrowed kindness. I put it down. I went stake to stake with my hands behind my back to keep the impulse to fix from running ahead of me. At the ridge stake, I felt the delayed hitch as a small kindness. It arrived as if pointing to a clock I could not see. At the downwind stake, the leash sound grew fainter, a dog that will not test the line while visitors watch. The crown flag refused to face me. The basin flag leaned a breath farther toward the interior. The approach flag went slack and then recovered without a wind to justify either state. I set up the base on the exact footprints I had used before, heel and toe matching that old grammar so precisely it felt like stubbornness shading into prayer. The points came sweetly loyal, and the shape assembled itself true except for the slightest sidle, a slide my eye would have dismissed if my notebook had not already taught me to watch that corner. I wrote grid slide sideways, then left a blank for what that might cost later. I called the logger a name I only use when alone, the kind of name you give a creature you want to coax into telling you what it hides. And I asked it in the privacy of my breath to keep its cadence readable for the span of a handful of breaths more. It did, and then it did not. And then it pretended it had never failed. The wind tried on a higher note along the ridge and gave it up. I let the silence settle until my ears began to invent a hiss that lives only in vessels left on a stove too long. The ice returned the velvet on paper murmur in the shallow register it favors when it would like to be ignored. I pretended to ignore it and wrote a report sentence that would pass an audit. No visible movement. Acoustic texture at surface intermittent. No hazard. Continued observation. Then I turned the page and admitted a thing to myself that I would not put in any formal channel. The saddle's calm feels learned, not given. By the time light thinned toward its hard middle, the shadow stammer gathered itself into something like a rule. Not every pass, not matched to wind, not matching the moth tick, but too consistent to chalk away as glare. I placed the snowsaw flat on the crust, so the shadow fell across its back and watched the blade's edge for a breath. The way you read a seismograph by touch. The shadow hesitated, then shrugged, then pretended nothing had happened. The blade did not move. The hand holding it felt the faintest traveling buzz, a pressure change no instrument of mine could claim. I took my hand away and the sensation stayed in the skin as if it belonged to me rather than the world. I ate a small lump of the station's sweet ration to convince my blood that I was at least one person, not a swarm of nerves. The sugar followed its path, and with it came the small discipline that lets a technician walk past wonder without being rude to it. I stood at the crown and spoke to the flags as to a polite committee. You will keep your places. I will not take minutes from you today. You will remain as you are until light leaves. I will return with manners. The flags did not nod. They offered their blank cloth faces and a faint tremor that I could not sell to myself as wind. When I finally turned the sled toward home, I did it as a demonstration rather than a surrender. I looked back between each glide and found the grid unchanged and subtly wrong, like a painting hung fractionally canted in a corridor that no one uses except the person who put the nail in. At the edge of the crown, the downwind stake made the leash sound again in farewell, and the shadow paused to listen, and then both sensations went still, as if they had been startled by their own existence. I left the flags in place as promised. Their stems kept their shallow roots, and their claws remembered their quiet. I let the notebook rest against my chest until it took the shape of my breathing. On the way down the approach, the snow under the skins felt slightly different, a suction that should have belonged to warmth, but did not. I stopped once and looked back. The saddle looked like any other, a polite divot in a country that refuses to admit hollows. All the wrongnesses I had gathered fit into words small enough to misplace. I wanted badly to remove at least one flag, to take away a marker so the day could not keep writing when I was not watching. I did not. The lesson from older hands had been plain and patient. When a place begins to speak, do not tidy its mouth. The station door received me with its known latch groan, and the stove received a stick with gratitude. I set the logger on the table and left it quiet for a span. Not as punishment, but as courtesy, as if I had brought a guest in from a long walk and wanted to offer water before questions. When I finally woke it, the files sat rimmed with that tidy look that makes a person tired. I did not read them yet. I wrote a line across the top of a fresh page in the book, the way a person stakes a claim gently. Leave flags in place until the saddle forgets me or says my name out loud. In my bunk, I let the day replay in sensible order, and then out of order, and then as a set of single stills. In every version, the grid slid a whisper. In every version, the logger took its small liberty and returned. In one version, a private one I did not commit to paper, the crown lifted a fraction and settled, the way a resting chest does when a sleeper refrains from waking. I do not believe that version. I only know it belongs to me now, the way a smell once named continues to live in the corner of a room you pass through in the dark. Tomorrow, I will return with the same manners and the same refusal to tidy. I will ask again. I will listen to the wrong side of things. I will leave the flags in place until either patience or weather finds the courage to be rude. Morning made a clean edge of everything, as if the night had sharpened the saddle with a wet stone. I told the station that I would conduct a noon pass to confirm grid stability and verify flag posture, the sort of sentence that leaves everyone calm, and I left the door before anyone could be generous with suggestions. The kit rode in its practiced places, logger nested close for warmth, base quiet in its foam, saw in its sock, notebook against my ribs where it could take the shape of the day early. The wind stayed cautious, testing the ridge with a thin reed and withdrawing, like someone about to knock and thinking better of it. Under my skins, the approach carried a mild drag. Not quite suction. The hint of a slow hand under the surface saying, wait. The flags waited as promised. Crown kept its blank face averted. Basin leaned its same hair toward the interior, a courtesy that admits no reason. Ridge had taught itself a small twist in the rope that had not been there yesterday. The approach flag seemed embarrassed by its own stillness. I put a palm to each stem and felt nothing a person could call motion, only the steady, faint grind of frost seeding and unseeding somewhere tooth-fine. The stakes stood as if for inspection, collars honest, witness chalk intact except for the tiny nick I had crossed out in the book yesterday with the phrase I still disliked writing. I did not fix the chalk. I let the wrongness keep its mark. I built the base on the same trio of dimples I had made before, heel and toe to their old grammar, and tucked a careful little berm in at the lee leg. The solar lid opened with its domestic crackle. The logger's moth tick began in tidy measure, and then tripped one step like a dancer who recognizes the song and makes a private flourish. My hand moved to the notebook by reflex and then did not write it once. I listened until the tick returned to the school and only then put down the plainest possible words. I pressed the mast with my brow until the sting made my thoughts straight. If the saddle wanted noon, I would give it noon, without show, without impatience. I took the grid corners slow and predictable, pausing the precise span my body has learned as the length of a breath you trust. Crown to basin, basin to interior, interior to ridge, ridge to crown. The base purred obedience, points lining up like a row of careful buttons. The loop closure went tidy again, over-tidy, the picture praising me for a walk my legs did not quite remember taking. I thanked the base under my breath, as one thanks a tool that has nearly convinced itself it is the worker. I marked only the feeling, picture smooth, path mildly stubborn, both insisting on being right. The sun climbed to the shoulder that turned shadows into useful rulers. I stood at the downwind stake and watched its dark twin draw a line across the crust. The line hesitated once, a swallow between words, then found itself again. A breath later, the ridge stake's shadow made the same courtesy, delayed agreement, reticent witness. I put a finger near the downwind collar without touching, and felt the faintest tremble in my own hand, a sympathetic vibration that may have belonged to my blood or to the ice or to the space between them that sometimes acts like a bridge. The logger took one liberty and returned to the law. The wind tried to thread a second note through its reed and declined. I had promised myself I would not move anything, not today. Keeping promises on the ice is a craft, not a virtue. I cut a shallow slot with the saw beside the downwind collar so I could bring my face close without kissing the stake itself. The teeth gave the dry glass whisper, and then a soft chatter over a thin crust that had not been there the last time I passed this way. In the face, the grains leaned their tiny ears again, willing, attentive, a court turned toward an invisible witness. The smell came up faint and unembarrassed. A page warmed in a sun patch and shut again. I said the words to myself, not aloud this time, old book, and let the idea sit without being fed more. I closed the slot with the back of the blade, a lid respectful of what it had briefly opened. Noon on a saddle does not ring a bell. It arrives as a composure in the light, a firmness of shadow that makes an instrument out of everything upright. I set the notebook on the sled so the pages would soak a little warmth and not scrawl like a saw on old bone. I stood between the stakes where the crown's breath feels most even and watched the downwind shadow harden into its noon line. It held true for the span of a slow breath, then it shortened by a shave and stepped aside one glove's width without moving its source. Not a sway, not a flicker, a decision. My own shadow kept steady. The ridge stake's dark twin matched the gesture a heartbeat later. The basin flag turned its cloth, as if to witness only the end of it. All my quiet plans came to their small test. I neither raised a hand nor spoke. I watched until the line regained its place. Then I moved my boots the length of a courtesy step and let the light remake the measure. The line paused again, not at my encouragement, not at any wind, at its own idea. I wrote as plainly as the paper allowed. Noon line makes small side step without motion of stake. Repeat at ridge with delay. Base and logger calm. My pencil left a smear where the glove brushed the line. a clumsy human thumbprint against an event that did not want one. The bass finished another polite set and asked me nothing more than to move the pole to keep it fed. I refused for a span and listened to the logger's moth tap. The cadence in that span grew familiar the way a lullaby your mother never sang still manages to be known. Taller teeth, shorter teeth, a return to neatness. The soft click of an extra beat added like a hidden stitch. I pressed my ear to the mast. Ridiculous gesture. Private and felt, not heard. The tiniest marching sensation, like a page being turned far away in a quiet library, the fingertips lifting and lowering with care so the paper would not tear. I took the pole through another circuit to make my obedience a visible ritual. Crown to basin, basin to interior, interior to ridge, ridge to crown. The drawing that came back wanted to tip itself again, a perfect slant pretending to be the square I had walked. I did not argue with it in words. I stood in the shape and let the slant settle into my legs until both truths could be true at once. The world that map loves and the world my boots insist upon. The feeling that I was being measured returned, but it had softened into something almost companionable. The way a tailor touching lightly at the waist makes even self-consciousness feel like being seen and not judged. The handheld cleared its throat in my pocket and left a brief, polite ping. I gave it the silence I had asked for and the respect it deserved. If I spoke then, the day would break into speech, and speech would break the day. The flags accepted the quiet. The ridge reed made a single long tone like a held breath. The logger tapped its moth clock and pretended it had never taken liberties. I stayed inside the minute where the shadow ruled, a person standing still because data likes stillness, and for the first time since I started this work, I let the idea arrive whole and unadorned. The saddle knows noon, not as light alone, but as a cue in some other grammar. And the stakes, being simple and honest things, are learning to answer. I do not write beliefs, I write affordances. I wrote, noon cue present, instrument shadows respond, surface holds, undersurface acoustic texture present, no hazard. Then I turned the page and wrote the sentence that would buy me a gentle note from a supervisor and possibly a patient talk later. Recommend extended noon watch with all markers left in place. No removals until pattern stabilizes or fails. Except Maplina's field condition. The pencil lifted and the paper carried a faint warmth from my chest where the book had lived. I closed the cover and held it against the jacket a moment longer than was necessary. The sun eased beyond the exact ruler's place, and the lines relaxed into the less useful forms of mid-afternoon. The downwind stake offered one last guilty rasp under my glove, as if to apologize for having been seen. The ridge stake waited its customary breath and offered the same, dignified even in its small trespass. The flags grew ordinary again, cloth like cloth. The bass folded its blue blink into the regular pulse of a thing that will not admit to having played. I broke the mast down with the care you give a story someone trusted you with and did not move a single stem, a single collar, a single chalk line. On the approach, I stopped where the slope shifts from saddle language to the vernacular of home and looked back. The grid sat where I had left it, and also not there, the way a word spoken too often stops meaning itself and becomes sound. I promised aloud, quietly, with manners, to return the next highlight and to ask the same questions the same way, to act as if my body were a metronome that could lend steadiness to a place practicing new steps. The wind took the promise and did not mock it. At the station door, I told the room a harmless version of the day. I laid the logger on the table and let it rest like a guest invited to sit before explaining what they had seen. I warmed my fingers over the stove and found they shook, only a little, the way a person's hands tremble after carrying a heavy box when the box has been set down. I wrote the final line for the entry with the pencil steadied in both fists. Leave flags in place, return at next noon, let the saddle speak its own length, no tidying, no teaching. The words looked simple and domestic. I liked them for that. Outside, the ice practiced its silence with care. Inside, the logger blinked like a heartbeat that had decided to be counted only when someone was watching. The next highlight found me already on the approach, skins whispering, sled docile behind. I had slept little and well enough, the sort of sleep that feels like a hand pressed lightly on the sternum to remind the breath to keep its manners. The radio had offered a cautious blessing at dawn, and I had answered in the steady voice I save for bridges, ladders, and equipment that believes itself temperamental. The logger rode inside my jacket where it could borrow my heat. The bass lay quiet in its cradle. The snow saw in its sock hummed with imagined work. and the field notebook warmed the cloth over my ribs like a tame animal. I planned nothing beyond the rule I had written. Ask the same questions, in the same order, and do not tidy the conversation. The saddle stood as I had left it, and also not. Frost had written a small gloss over the chalk rings and dulled the neat ankles of snow at the stakes. The flags held their poses like actors on a stage between scenes, faces arranged, bodies remembering something the mouth had not yet said. The wind picked a single register and held it, reeds singing from the ridge with the kind of discipline I wish for from instruments. I did not speak to any of it. I placed the bass where it likes to stand, tucked the little berm into the lee leg, set the solar lid, and listened for the logger's moth tick. It began as dutifully as any morning and tripped once out of courtesy to our private joke, then settled back into the school. I pressed the mast with my forehead until the sting cleared the last shadow from my thinking and took up the notebook with a care that felt like apology. I walked the grid corners slow, letting the poles plant in the crust with that dry click that says good footing. Crown to basin, basin to interior, interior to ridge, ridge to crown. The pictures came polite and a touch overgracious, loop closure praising me as if I had learned overnight to walk like a machine. I let the flattery pass through me and wrote only what I knew my legs would remember. Path good enough, picture a little too proud, accept both. The flags watched, claws unanimated, stem sounds small and fussy in the cold, as if settling their collars for a portrait. The sun climbed toward the place where shadow becomes instrument. While I waited for that exactness, I cut a shallow slot near the downwind collar with the saw and leaned close. The teeth sang their dry glass note and chattered across a lace-thin crust that had come in the night. The smell lifted, honest and faint. Old paper, less sure of itself than yesterday, as if the shelf had moved deeper into shade. The face of the pit showed the same tilting grains, an audience angled toward witness. I held my breath to let the day breathe and tasted the nothing that belongs to places this clean, and the little ghost of sweetness that refuses to answer questions. When the light firmed, I set myself where my shadow would not confuse theirs and watched the downwind stake's dark twin slide into its noon line. It held like a plumb line inturned into ice. Then, with the quiet decision I had come to know, it shortened and stepped aside by a distance no human eye would dignify in a courtroom, and every honest worker would name to a friend. A breath later, the ridge stake matched it, decorous delay intact. I did nothing. I listened to the logger tap its moth clock and pretend not to garnish it with a private flourish. I told myself that this was simply an unkind trick of light on a day grown overconfident, and told myself, aloud this time, that I believed neither argument. The bass blinked its blue eye in the same polite meter it offers to people who trust it completely. The grid shape that had delighted the instrument yesterday leaned again into a slant my boots did not share. I stood in the middle of both truths and let them be neighbors. The flags gave a small, coordinated tremor, not wind, not eagerness, more like the bracing breath a person takes on a doorstep before lifting a hand to knock. I could have convinced myself I imagined it if the logger had not taken a single extra tap, tall and then humble, and buried it immediately in good behavior. I put my glove on the downwind collar and felt no movement at all, just the cold, which is a kind of mercy. The leash-sound did not answer me. It did, however, arrive through the ice itself when my palm had already lifted. The faint pet slide I had learned in the last days, a sound of a tie taking one thoughtless inch and then blushing. I glanced at the chalk. The frost gloss had taken it. The little nick I had not liked writing was gone under the lacquer of a night's breath. That felt fair. A place has the right to erase a conversation it did not wish recorded. I moved to the ridge stake and set my cheek to the metal again. The low speech of the body beneath ran quietly, even, as if it had grown tired of the game and wanted only to be heavy and good. Then the delayed hitch came, wrapped small, the way a child brings you a found feather, cupped in their hands. I thanked it under my breath and stood long enough for the wind to thread a reed through the hood and make a minute of music of my posture. From that angle, with eyelashes stinging, the whole grid seemed to quiver against the world like a heat shimmer. I blinked and it became crust again. I wrote nothing down. I had promised not to pull a stem, not to stamp a collar, not to teach. I kept the promise through the bright middle and the shallow slide into afternoon. The noon line played its sidestep twice, not on my watch, not on my clapping, entirely of its own calendar. Each time the logger put on its modest flourish and folded it away. Each time the bass pretended I was a better walker than I am. The flags held their silence like practiced choir boys. I felt measured as before, and less troubled by it, the way a patient feels at the seamstress's chalk. A little owned, yes, and also seen. I gave the radio a non-committal assurance and asked to extend the watch to the thin edge where shadow ceases to be useful and begins to be a rumor. Permission returned with a warning about the wind later, and a suggestion of warm fuel at the station. I said the courtesy words and let the set sleep. I stood very still and asked myself whether the cost of this quiet would come in cold or in thinking too much. The body answered with a chill that climbed the bones in the honest stair-step way cold takes when it has found purchase. The mind answered by opening the door to the wrong question. What would it mean to leave the grid as a permanent habit on this saddle, to make it a ledger the ice could use when I was elsewhere? I packed the base with the care of a librarian shelving a book you are not done borrowing. I left the flags as promised. I pressed the snow saw against its sock and wiped the frost from the teeth so they would not bite the cloth. I placed my palm on each collar in turn. Not for readings, only for etiquette. The downwind stake gave me nothing. The ridge offered its dignified little late acknowledgement. The crown kept its mouth. A petrel cut the air where the basin falls and left no argument behind. I put my hand on the notebook, through the jacket, and felt my own pulse. A metronome offered to a place that might not need one. On the way down, I stopped where the approach forgets it was ever a line, and becomes simply the long way home. The saddle sat full in the eye behind me, modest and without self-pity, a place ordinary enough to hide inside grander maps. The grid was too small to love at that distance, and still I felt it. A memory of alignment in my legs, a slant in the picture behind the lids when I blinked. The wind moved a hair under the ridge and dropped the thought. I told the day my last rule out loud so that I would be accountable to its echo. Nothing moves, nothing taut, leave the flags until weather chooses. If they fall by the saddle's will, not mine. Back at the station, I set the logger on the table and let it rest warm. I did not download. I boiled water and watched the steam tow tiny ghosts up toward the ceiling, where they made agreements I had no rights to sign. When I finally woke the machine, the files presented themselves with that same tidy face. The noon window looked like my other noon, a run of calm teeth, a modest flourish, a return to grammar. I scrolled to the end and found a short quiet where the logger had paused long enough to have missed one breath, and then returned with neatness, as if it had turned its head to listen and then pretended it had not. I wrote transient in the log and did not say it out loud. Sleep came late. I woke once and swore I heard a page turn somewhere safe and dark. When morning came again, I went out with the intention to collect flags, tell the station a version of the truth that would not require meetings, and restore the saddle to its before. The wind had been busy. A light fall had come without storm, a sift downward that finds every little story and writes over it carefully. The flags stood shorter in their holes, and then not at all, their claws pressed into a surface that had chosen smoothness. The collars were round again without chalk or nicks. The stakes kept their dignified arms at their sides, shadows thin and obedient in the weak light. The grid, if it lived, had gone under the gentlest possible erasure. I stood a long while with my gloves on the grips and my breath kept small so as not to rehearse grief. Nothing had moved, and everything had. I could have dug, raised each flag, insisted on continuity. I did not. The lesson from older hands felt wise in that minute, and also insufficient. When a place begins to speak, do not tidy its mouth. The saddle had tidied itself. I wrote one line in the book, and could not tell whether the words belonged to the day or to me. White ledger closed, lesson ongoing. Then I closed the notebook and held it against my chest until it remembered my heat. On the way home, the skins hissed the same, the rope tugged the same, the ridge sang its old single note. I carried the sense of being measured with more ease, as if the tape had been put away and a tailor had simply kept my size. In the evening, I left the logger lamp on and did not count its blinks. Somewhere beyond the plywood and the friendly stove, the saddle lay quiet and complete, practicing the steps it had shown me or not, making its noon or choosing stillness. I will return when the weather finds its patience, not to demand a story, only to set the base, touch the collars with manners, and ask the same questions in the same order. If nothing answers, the grid will be my answer. If something does, the notebook will warm in my pocket, and I will listen to the wrong side of things, until I can no longer tell which side is which.